All right, so now you've got some images that you have actually got prepped and ready to go, and now you need to get them out to the next purpose. Obviously, exporting is what you do, and I'll probably say this same intro on every one of the options of exporting. But right now we're going to discuss exporting for the purposes of printing out of other programs. One of the drawbacks or uniqueness of working with both Capture One and Lightroom at the same time, or even Photoshop, is that Capture One is really not used as a program that people print out of, and sometimes some of the features that you can choose and set up for printing aren't easily accessible inside of Capture One. We've seen some nuances over the years. So most people will export back out of here, and then once the image has been exported, then they'll bring it into whichever program they use to print out of. So for instance, I would create this image as for our purposes today. I'm going to show you both Photoshop and Tiff, which aren't much different, but I'm going to go ahead and export these out so that they can come into Lightroom and be used to print, or into Photoshop if I'm exporting to Photoshop to do more heavy lifting. So for our purposes, I'm going to go ahead and grab a couple of images for the export. So we have 4 images selected to be exported out, and these are all from original RAW files. So now what I'm going to go ahead and do is I will choose export here, or I can go to the export tool tab. So we're in here. Now, by default, the Capture One actually has a bunch of built-in export recipes. And what a recipe is that when you go in and set up all of your settings for export and then say save it as a new export recipe, it actually puts it in here, which allows you to create an export basically an export preset like you do inside of Adobe Lightroom. Adobe Lightroom has presets, they call them recipes in here. So for example, if I want to send this straight into Photoshop with an Adobe RGB color space ready to go, I could basically go in here and say, okay, here is a 16-bit Adobe 1998, and basically if I hover on it, I have to make sure that the bar is actually highlighted. Even if I'm highlighting here, I have to keep in mind that the settings are different based on each one of these. So as I'm choosing to export out, you have to make sure that you've got the one that you want to go. But you can also send out 2 at the same time, where you can basically go in and check that checkbox too. And then with both checkboxes checked, you will actually be exporting out both a PSD and a TIFF at the same time. Now, a lot of times people like to work in Photoshop as a 16-bit image, which gives you just a wider color space to work in. Obviously, these are black and white images, but you still kind of want them to stay as a color image because of the way that the printing works. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let's create Photoshop files. And then we will go ahead and, sorry about that, guys. We will go in and we've got cross recipe tokens, which are options to put in tokens, which we'll get more into tokens later, so we're not going to apply that right now. Export location, you could say put it in the same folder as original, or put it in a subfolder in there, or you could choose to go ahead and put it on the choose a folder, have it pop up, and for this instance, for example, I might be using these for the printing from various papers assignment. So I might go ahead and, if that's what I was using this for, so in this case, I would basically be sending these out to get printed, and then I probably wouldn't need them after that. So I basically go in and, for our purposes, I'll go to the desktop, I'll create a new folder. I can name this for whatever the job is. I'm going to go ahead and call this A04 for the job, and today I'll use my last name. And then I'll go ahead and say create, and that's where it's actually going to go ahead and put the image. I say choose it, boom, we're set there. If the file already exists, like I exported out previously, you could say overwrite or add a new suffix to it, so it could be a different version. This will show you the sample path just to confirm where it's going. If you pop this open, it'll show you basically where you're going, which is easy to see. Oops. All right, so that's export location. I'm going to go ahead and close this down. Export naming. If I need to name these as they're going out, I could name them here. So for example, if the job name is specific, I can go in here, click, and look at a variety of tokens that are already preset file naming options. For example, the state of the image, or the image name, or day of the month, time of day that it was shot, those types of things. So I can add all kinds of features to the actual file naming. Some of this is pretty powerful if you're doing photojournalism, where you actually have to have all kinds of specific information. You can pull from all kinds of areas of the metadata as you're doing this. But for our purposes, I'm going to go in and I'm just going to go ahead and delete the token that's already in, and then I'm going to type in A01. I'm going to do an underscore, actually A04 underscore McDonald, and then I'm going to do another underscore, and I'm going to pull in a digit counter, and I'm going to go ahead and put a 2-digit image counter behind that. And basically, if I double click this, it will actually pop it up there once I've chosen which option I want under the counter, and then it'll give you an example sample of what the file name will look like. And I'll go ahead and say OK. So now it's going to be basically naming the files like this. There's 4 of them. It'll be 1 through 4. Export format and size. Now these are the default settings, and for printing purposes 300 dpi is absolutely perfect, but there might be other purposes to export out a PSD at different sizes. If you're working in photojournalism and it's going to newsprint, it might be only needed to be in 200 dpi or 170, so it depends on what your purposes are, but for our purposes the default one in here is great. I'll go ahead and close that. File name is good. Export adjustments, respect the crop, and no output sharpening. Now, if I'm going to be printing, I could say go ahead and output these images with a sharpening applied for printing. Every image that needs to be printed needs to be sharpened ahead of time, and a lot of times your printing dialog boxes don't have that option, so you can go in and add that at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and say that, or I could just say no output sharpening, which, since I'm going to be using Lightroom to print, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. Export a watermark. If I feel like I need to have a watermark on here, I can do that. Exporting metadata. What information do I need to go out with these images? And for example, GPS coordinates, I might say no, I don't want that, because I don't want people to know the location where I shot. Obviously camera metadata is okay. Other metadata might be okay unless I've done some processing that might export out, and I don't want people to see my styles and stuff, so I might want to turn that off. And I can also make sure that the copyright is set. Then we go to export summary, and this basically gives me a summary of exactly what I'm about to do, including tell me how big the file will be once it gets exported. So it's going to be a rather large image. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. If I decided not to do the Photoshop file and I was doing a TIFF instead, the TIFF file would actually be smaller. It's 9 megabytes because it's only an 8-bit image. So that would be that. Or if I decided to go back into the Photoshop, and I decided to go in here while the Photoshop is selected, and let's go ahead and create a new recipe, and we'll start here. We will change this into a Photoshop at 8-bit, and then I will go ahead and create a new token. And there's my new 8-bit export. So that'll make a little bit smaller file size, so it'll be a little bit more manageable. Because it's a PSD file, it's going to be 35 megabytes as opposed to a TIFF that could be smaller. TIFFs are smaller because they actually end up having a little bit of a compression applied when they're done. So that's one of those things to keep in mind when you're looking at that. So now that I've got that ready to go, This is the export queue, which tells you how long it's taking to do it. You'll see a status bar down here at the bottom. And once I get this ready to go, I'll go ahead and make sure that all the images are selected again. Oops, not these. So it's just basically these 5 images. I will go ahead and click export. Once again, if I'm using the tool tab when I'm doing this, it will always open up. Basically, now that I've played with it in the tool tab, when I click export up here, it will open up the export engine. It shows me everything I just did, similar to what you're looking at a couple minutes ago. And then I go ahead and down here it says, do you want to export all 5 of these images? And you go ahead and click export, and it rolls through the queue. Down here it shows each one of the images as they're being exported. It shows you a status bar going across here. And once it's done, it will be basically done.